Doctor publicly humiliates black nurse, not knowing she's a medical director. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's dive in. Claire Lawson had always believed in the value of hard work and humility. In her early 40s, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that stemmed not from title or recognition, but from years of dedication, perseverance, and overcoming the challenges that had defined her journey. Claire was a woman of substance, a leader who never sought attention or fanfare. Her presence in the halls of Oak Ridge Medical Center, one of the most prestigious hospitals in Boston, was that of a person who moved with purpose, but without the need for recognition. Today, Claire found herself donning a uniform she hadn't worn regularly in years. She was filling in for a nurse on leave, taking on the duties she had started with many years ago. As the medical director of the hospital, Claire's responsibilities usually kept her in meetings or overseeing the departments, ensuring the hospital ran smoothly. But she never considered any task beneath her, especially when it involved direct patient care. The crisp white nurse's scrubs were a reminder of the long hours and sleepless nights she had endured during her early career. For Claire, nursing had been more than a job. It had been her lifeline, the first step on a journey toward a dream that had once seemed unattainable. Growing up in a low-income neighborhood, Claire had known that opportunities were scarce for people like her. Yet she refused to let her circumstances define her. With a relentless determination, she worked her way through medical school, paying her dues with long shifts and exhaustive study sessions. There had been many moments when the pressure had seemed insurmountable, but Claire was nothing if not resilient. Nursing had been her way into the medical field, but she had always dreamed of making a bigger impact on climbing higher and using her skills to change the system from within. Oak Ridge Medical Center was a gleaming institution, one that catered to Boston's elite. The hospital's reputation had been built on cutting-edge technology, top-tier professionals, and its ability to serve the wealthy and influential. But beneath the polished exterior, there were cracks. The hospital's culture, like many in the medical field, was hierarchical. Doctors reigned supreme, often viewing themselves as far superior to the nurses and support staff. There was an unspoken but clear division between those who wore white coats and those who wore scrubs. It was a culture Claire had been quietly working to change ever since she became medical director. She had seen firsthand the way nurses were treated as second-class citizens in the medical world. Despite their critical role in patient care, they were often spoken to dismissively, their opinions overlooked, and their contributions undervalued. Claire's office, located on the top floor, gave her a view of the hospital's bustling courtyard. It was a constant reminder of the institution she was responsible for and the work she still needed to do. The promotion to medical director hadn't come easily. Claire's journey to the top had been marked by moments of doubt and frustration, but she had always found a way to push through. The staff at Oak Ridge respected her, not because of her title, but because of her approach. She had never been one to flaunt her position or demand deference. Claire believed that leadership wasn't about commanding authority, but about earning respect through understanding and empathy. Today, as she moved through the hospital in her nurse's scrubs, most of the staff recognized Claire for who she was. They knew she was the medical director and admired her willingness to step in when needed. But there were some, particularly newer employees, or those who weren't as attuned to the inner workings of the hospital, who didn't realize her significance. Claire didn't mind. She was more focused on ensuring that the patients received the care they needed and that the hospital ran smoothly during her temporary return to nursing duties. The hospital halls buzzed with activity. Nurses hurried from room to room, while doctors strode down the corridors with an air of authority. It was a typical day at Oak Ridge, where the patients ranged from prominent CEOs to celebrities seeking the best medical care money could buy. For Claire, every patient deserved the same level of care, regardless of their status. As she checked patient charts and coordinated with the staff, Claire felt a sense of nostalgia. This was the work she had started with, and it grounded her in a way that board meetings and administrative duties never could. The sound of monitors beeping, the steady flow of nurses moving in and out of rooms, and the occasional call over the PA system brought back memories of her early days on the hospital floor. Her attention was focused on ensuring that the files and charts were up to date, that the medication schedules were followed, and that the patients were comfortable. For Claire, this was second nature, a rhythm she had never truly left behind, even as her career had progressed. Among the doctors in the hospital was one who stood out, not for his medical expertise, but for his reputation as a difficult colleague. Dr. Samuel Price was a middle-aged white man who had spent years rising through the ranks. His medical skill was undeniable, but his attitude toward those he deemed beneath him was a constant source of tension. Dr. Price was notorious for his arrogance. He treated nurses as little more than assistants, there to carry out his orders without question or input. The nurses had long learned to tolerate Dr. Price's condescension. He barked orders, rarely said please or thank you, and seemed to view the nursing staff as an obstacle to his efficiency rather than integral members of the healthcare team. To him, respect was something that flowed only upward, toward those he considered equals, other doctors, senior administrators, and sometimes the occasional well-known patient. Dr. Price was part of the culture Claire was trying to change. While she had heard numerous complaints about him from the nurses under her leadership, Claire had always believed in addressing systemic issues rather than targeting individuals. She understood that changing the culture of an institution required time and patience. Still, she knew that sooner or later, she and Dr. Price were bound to cross paths. In a hospital like Oak Ridge, where power dynamics were constantly at play, it was only a matter of time. Today would be that day. Dr. Samuel Price arrived at Oak Ridge Medical Center with his usual brisk pace, his mind already preoccupied with the day ahead. His schedule was packed: surgeries, consultations, and what he considered the tiresome task of managing the expectations of high-profile patients. Dr. Price thrived in the high-pressure environment of the hospital, but his approach to leadership and teamwork was far from ideal. To him, efficiency was paramount, and anyone who slowed down the process was a liability, not a colleague. As he stepped into the ward where Claire Lawson had been stationed for the day, his eyes scanned the room. He didn't notice Claire among the nurses at first. His gaze slid over her, not recognizing her as the hospital's medical director in her plain white scrubs. To him, she was just another nurse, and that made her invisible in his eyes. Dr. Price didn't care about names or faces when it came to nurses. They were simply there to assist him in performing his duties. Claire, busy reviewing patient charts, didn't notice him either. She was focused on making sure everything was in order for the day's rounds. Her attention was on her patients, not on the hierarchy that Dr. Price was so invested in. But Dr. Price's mood was already sour. He had run into a delay earlier that morning, and now, seeing what he perceived as a nurse idling, his frustration bubbled to the surface. Without any formal introduction, he strode toward her, his voice sharp with impatience. "Are you planning to stand there all day?" he snapped, his tone laced with condescension. "These patient files need to be updated immediately. Can't you follow simple instructions?" Claire paused, momentarily caught off guard by the sharpness of his tone. She glanced at the chart in her hand, making sure everything was in order before turning to face him. There was no recognition in Dr. Price's eyes, no awareness of who she was or the position she held. He was simply barking orders, assuming she was just another nurse who needed to be put in her place. Claire's expression remained calm, though a flicker of irritation crossed her mind. She was not accustomed to being spoken to in such a manner, but her years of experience had taught her how to handle situations like this with grace. She had always believed that maintaining her composure was more important than responding in anger. "I'm following standard protocol, doctor," Claire replied, her voice measured. "The files will be updated shortly." But Dr. Price wasn't interested in her explanation. His eyes narrowed and he waved her off dismissively as if her words were an inconvenience. "I don't have time for excuses," he retorted, his voice rising. "This hospital is already struggling enough without staff like you slowing things down." Claire felt the sting of his words, not because they were true, but because of the assumptions behind them. He hadn't bothered to ask who she was or what her qualifications might be. He had simply looked at her, a black woman in a nurse's uniform, and decided that she was the problem. The other nurses in the room exchanged uneasy glances. They knew who Claire was, and the tension in the air thickened with each passing second. Dr. Price, oblivious to the discomfort he was causing, pressed on. Dr. Price's frustration was evident as he gestured toward Claire in an exaggerated manner. his voice now loud enough to draw the attention of other staff members in the vicinity. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "No sense of urgency, no attention to detail. It's no wonder things don't run smoothly around here with staff like this." The weight of his accusation hung in the air, heavy with unfair judgment. Claire stood there, feeling the eyes of the room on her, but she refused to let her expression change. She was hurt, yes, but more than that, she was angry, not because he was right, but because he was wrong in every way that mattered. He didn't know her qualifications, her background, or her experience. He didn't know her at all. He had simply seen a nurse in front of him and assumed she was beneath him. It wasn't just about him not recognizing her as the medical director. It was the deeper implication behind his words, that someone like her, a black woman, didn't belong in a place like Oak Ridge, a place that prided itself on its elite status. The insult was subtle, but Claire caught it immediately. Dr. Price wouldn't have spoken this way to one of his peers, nor would he have been so dismissive of someone he respected. The silence that followed was deafening. The other staff members, including the junior doctors who had been nearby, stood frozen, unsure of whether to intervene or stay out of the line of fire. Claire felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she swallowed it back. This wasn't the time or place. She could have easily revealed her position right then and there. She could have told Dr. Price that she was the medical director of this very hospital, that she held more authority than he could imagine. But what good would it do? Publicly confronting him wouldn't fix the underlying issue. It wouldn't change his attitude, and it certainly wouldn't address the deeper biases that had led to this moment. Instead, Claire chose to take a different approach. "I'll make sure everything is handled," she said quietly, her voice steady but firm. Dr. Price barely acknowledged her words. He had already turned away, too absorbed in his own frustration to notice the impact of what he had said. "Just get it done," he muttered as he stormed off, leaving a trail of tension in his wake. After Dr. Price's departure, Claire stood for a moment, her hand still holding the patient chart, her mind racing. She had been humiliated in front of her colleagues, treated as though she were less than, as though she didn't belong. But it wasn't just because she had stepped back into the role of a nurse for the day. It was because of who she was, a black woman in a prestigious setting where Dr. Price believed she had no place. The other staff members remained silent, their discomfort palpable. They had witnessed the exchange, and while no one had spoken up in the moment, they had seen how Claire had maintained her composure under pressure. Dr. Price might have humiliated her publicly, but Claire's dignity remained intact. She hadn't lashed out or let her anger show, and that in itself earned her a quiet respect from those who had watched. As Claire continued her rounds, the weight of the incident pressed down on her, but she didn't let it show. She finished her shift with the same quiet grace she had always carried, her mind already formulating the next steps. She wasn't going to let this moment slide, but she also wasn't going to confront Dr. Price directly. That wasn't the way to address the real issue. Instead, Claire knew she needed to approach this through the proper channels, addressing the culture of the hospital and the biases that had been allowed to fester unchecked. She had worked too hard to get to where she was, and she wasn't about to let someone like Dr. Price undermine her or the staff she was responsible for. Later that day, as Claire sat in her office, she reflected on the long road that had brought her to this point. The incident with Dr. Price wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, she had the power to do something about it. Feeling the need to talk to someone who would understand, Claire pulled out her phone and texted her close friend and colleague, Janelle Hayes. Within minutes, Janelle called her concern evident in her voice. "What happened today?" Janelle asked, already sensing that something was off. Claire hesitated for a moment, then recounted the incident with Dr. Price, the sting of his words still fresh in her mind. "He treated me like I was nothing," Claire said, her voice calm but tinged with frustration. "He assumed I didn't know what I was doing, that I was just another nurse who was in his way." Janelle was silent for a moment, but Claire could feel the anger simmering on the other end of the line. "And you didn't tell him who you were?" "No," Claire replied. "I didn't think it would solve anything. He wouldn't have listened anyway. It's not about me, Janelle. It's about the culture in this place, the way staff are treated, especially minority staff. I'll deal with it, but in the right way. Janelle sighed, her tone softening. You shouldn't have to deal with that, especially not from him. Claire leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the day settle on her. I know, but it's not just about this one incident. It's about something bigger, and I need to handle it carefully. As the week progressed, whispers about the incident between Claire and Dr. Samuel Price began to spread throughout Oak Ridge Medical Center. The nurses who had witnessed the confrontation shared the story quietly, though none of them dared approach Claire directly about it. There was a growing sense of unease among the staff, a silent acknowledgement that the power dynamics in the hospital were becoming more visible, more fragile. Dr. Price, on the other hand, continued with his day-to-day routine, blissfully unaware of the growing storm around him. He hadn't given the incident with Claire much thought after it happened. To him, it had been a routine interaction, a reminder to a nurse that she needed to keep up with the demands of the job. He didn't know, or care to know, that the nurse he had spoken down to was actually his superior. In his mind, the hierarchy of the hospital was simple. Doctors gave orders, and nurses followed them. That was the way things had always been, and that was the way they would remain. But Claire wasn't one to let things fester. She had spent years breaking down the walls that people like Dr. Price built around themselves, and she wasn't about to stop now. The tension between them was simmering beneath the surface, waiting for a moment to erupt. Claire knew that if she didn't address the situation soon, it could create a ripple effect throughout the hospital, further entrenching the divisions she had been working to dismantle. It was during a particularly hectic day at the hospital that the breaking point came. Dr. Price was in the middle of surgery when one of the nurses, visibly flustered, approached him with an urgent request for additional supplies. The operating room was already stretched thin, with multiple procedures scheduled back-to-back, and the supply shortage was causing delays. Dr. Price, already on edge from the pressures of the day, snapped. I don't have time for this, he barked at the nurse. If you can't do your job properly, then get out of the way and let someone else handle it. The nurse recoiled, her face flushed with embarrassment. She had only been trying to ensure the safety of the patients, but Dr. Price's harsh words made her feel small, insignificant. She hurried out of the operating room, her head down, tears threatening to spill. Word of the outburst spread quickly. It wasn't the first time Dr. Price had treated the nursing staff this way, but after the incident with Claire, tensions were higher than ever. The staff was beginning to wonder if anything would ever change, or if they were doomed to work in an environment where respect flowed only upward, never downward. Later that day, as Dr. Price strode through the hallways, still fuming from the earlier incident, he crossed paths with Claire. She was standing by the nurse's station, reviewing charts and coordinating care for a patient in critical condition. As always, Claire was calm, composed, focused on the task at hand. Dr. Price, his temper still on edge, didn't miss a beat. Without so much as a greeting, he marched up to Claire and began speaking in the same harsh tone he had used with the nurse earlier. You need to get your staff in order, he snapped. This hospital can't function if the nurses can't even manage basic tasks. If you can't handle your team, maybe someone else should. Claire looked up from the chart in her hands, meeting Dr. Price's gaze for the first time since their initial confrontation. Her expression was neutral, but there was a fire in her eyes that Dr. Price hadn't yet recognized. The room around them seemed quiet as other staff members noticed the exchange, their eyes flickering between Claire and Dr. Price. I think we need to talk, Dr. Price, Claire said calmly, her voice measured. Dr. Price, still not understanding the gravity of the situation, crossed his arms over his chest. I don't have time for this. I have patients waiting. This won't take long, Claire replied, her voice steady. We need to discuss the way you're treating the nursing staff and the assumptions you've made about me. Dr. Price's eyes narrowed in confusion, and for a moment he seemed to hesitate. What assumptions? He asked. His tone was still defensive. You've assumed a lot about me, Claire said, her voice never wavering, and you've treated me and others with a level of disrespect that can't continue. This hospital relies on the teamwork of every single person here, and that includes the nurses you've been treating like they're beneath you. Dr. Price's face flushed with irritation, and he took a step closer to Claire, his voice rising. If the nurses would just do their jobs. They are doing their jobs, Claire interrupted, her voice calm but firm. And so am I. For a moment, Dr. Price seemed taken aback by Claire's directness. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped when Claire took a step forward, meeting his gaze with a quiet intensity. "You still don't know who I am, do you?" Claire asked, her voice soft but pointed. Dr. Price blinked, his confusion deepening. "You're one of the nurses," he said, the words stumbling out awkwardly. "I'm not just a nurse," Claire replied. "I'm Claire Lawson, the medical director of this hospital." The silence that followed was palpable. Dr. Price's eyes widened as the realization of what she had just said sank in. His posture, once rigid and commanding, seemed to falter as he processed the weight of his mistake. The room around them felt suddenly too small, the eyes of the other staff members watching the exchange with bated breath. Dr. Price's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked around, as if hoping to find someone who could confirm that this wasn't happening, that Claire Lawson wasn't the person he had just insulted. Again. But there was no escape. The truth hung in the air between them, undeniable. I didn't realize," Price stammered, his usual bravado crumbling. "That's the problem," Claire said quietly. "You didn't realize because you didn't care to look beyond your own assumptions. You saw what you wanted to see, a nurse, someone you could order around, someone who you thought wasn't worthy of your respect." The other staff members, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, stood in silence, their respect for Claire deepening with every word she spoke. They had seen her endure Dr. Price's disrespect without retaliating, and now they understood why. Dr. Price's face had turned a deep shade of red, and for a moment it seemed as though he might lash out again. But he quickly realized there was no way to salvage his position. He humiliated not just any nurse, but the medical director of the entire hospital. "I'm sorry," Dr. Price finally managed, though the words felt hollow, forced. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to." "This isn't about one incident, Dr. Price," Claire interrupted, her voice calm but unyielding. "It's about the culture we've allowed to grow in this hospital, the way we treat each other, and the way we allow biases to influence our actions. I'm not interested in an apology. I'm interested in change." The words hit Dr. Price like a blow, and for the first time, he seemed to truly understand the magnitude of what had just happened. He had made a critical error in judgment, and it was one that couldn't simply be brushed aside. Later that evening, Claire sat in her office, the confrontation with Dr. Price still fresh in her mind. She had no intention of seeking revenge or public humiliation for him, but she knew that something had to change. This wasn't just about Dr. Price's behavior. It was about the systemic issues within the hospital, the culture that allowed people like him to believe they were superior simply because of their title. Claire began drafting a formal report, outlining the need for better training on respect and communication within the hospital. She highlighted the importance of addressing biases, both racial and hierarchical, that often went unchecked in the workplace. It wasn't about punishing Dr. Price. It was about ensuring that no one else had to endure the kind of treatment she had experienced. As she wrote, Claire felt a sense of resolve settling over her. The confrontation with Dr. Price had been difficult, but it had also been necessary. She had stood her ground, not out of pride, but out of a desire to create lasting change in the hospital. She had dedicated her life to improving. The day after the confrontation, the hospital was abuzz with quiet conversations and hushed tones. The story of what had happened between Claire Lawson and Dr. Samuel Price spread like wildfire. Nurses, doctors, and even the custodial staff had heard about the moment doctor. Price had been put in his place by the medical director, without even realizing who she was. For many, it was a long overdue reckoning. In the break rooms, the staff whispered about the incident with a mix of disbelief and admiration. For years, Dr. Price's arrogance had gone unchecked, his dismissive behavior tolerated simply because of his medical expertise. But now something has shifted. Claire had shown them that it was possible to stand up to someone like Dr. Price, not with anger, but with quiet dignity and strength. "I can't believe it," one nurse said, shaking her head as she sipped her coffee. "He had no idea who she was. Can you imagine? Treating your own boss like that?" "I don't think it's just about who she is," another nurse replied. "It's about how he treats everyone. Claire's been trying to change things here for years. Maybe now people will start paying attention. The younger staff members, particularly the new nurses and junior doctors, were in awe of Claire. Many of them had experienced similar dismissive behavior from more senior staff, but they had never felt empowered to speak up. Seeing Claire stand on her ground without raising her voice or losing her composure was inspiring. It gave them hope that the culture in the hospital could change. Dr. Price, however, was still largely oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He had always been confident in his role at Oak Ridge, believing that his medical skill was enough to shield him from any criticism. As far as he was concerned, the incident with Claire was an unfortunate misunderstanding, one that would blow over soon enough. As he sat in the doctor's lounge sipping his coffee, he recounted the events of the previous day to a younger colleague, Dr. Michael Cooper. Dr. Cooper was new to the hospital and had heard about Dr. Price's reputation long before he had ever met the man. He listened politely, though he felt uncomfortable with the way Dr. Price spoke about the nursing staff. "I had to put one of the nurses in her place yesterday," Dr. Price said, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "She was slowing things down, not paying attention to what needed to be done. You know how it is. Some people just aren't cut out for this kind of work." Dr. Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had always respected Claire Lawson from afar, having heard of her leadership style and her reputation for being a compassionate and fair director. Hearing Dr. Price speak this way didn't sit right with him, but he didn't want to get on Dr. Price's bad side so early in his career. "Yeah, maybe she was just having an off day," Dr. Cooper muttered, trying to diffuse the situation without directly challenging Dr. Price. Dr. Price shrugged, clearly not interested in further discussion. "Maybe, but I expect from the staff here. This hospital has a reputation to uphold, and we can't afford mistakes." Unbeknownst to Dr. Price, the whispers were growing louder. The story of what had happened between him and Claire wasn't going away, and the staff was beginning to wonder what the hospital leadership would do about it. In her office, Claire sat at her desk, reviewing the formal report she had drafted. The confrontation with Dr. Price had been uncomfortable, but it had also been a turning point for her. She had known for some time that the hospital needed to address the underlying biases in its culture, but now she had a clear path forward. The report wasn't about Dr. Price specifically, though his behavior had sparked the need for it. Instead, Claire focused on broader issues within the hospital, the lack of respect between departments, the dismissive attitude toward nurses and support staff, and the unchecked biases that permeated the workplace. She included recommendations for mandatory diversity and bias training, as well as a call for greater accountability among the medical staff. Claire knew this wouldn't be an easy battle. Changing the culture of an institution as large and prestigious as Oak Ridge would take time, and there would be resistance. But she was determined to push forward. This wasn't just about her or Dr. Price. It was about creating a better environment for everyone who worked at the hospital. As she reviewed the report one last time, her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Janelle Hayes, her close friend and colleague. "Janelle. Hey, I heard about what happened. Are you okay?" Claire smiled faintly as she typed her response. "Claire. I'm fine. It needed to happen. I'm drafting a formal report now to address the bigger issues." A few moments later, Janelle responded. "Janelle. Good. It's about time someone shook things up around here. Let me know if you need anything." Claire felt a surge of gratitude for Janelle's support. She wasn't in this alone, and that made all the difference. A few days later, Claire submitted the report to the hospital's senior leadership team, led by Mr. David Thompson, the chief administrator of Oak Ridge Medical Center. Mr. Thompson had always been supportive of Claire's efforts to improve the hospital, but he was also cautious about making waves. He knew that many of the senior doctors, including Dr. Price, were resistant to change. As Claire sat in the boardroom, waiting for the leadership meeting to begin, she felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. This meeting wasn't just about addressing the incident with Dr. Price. It was about confronting the deeper issues that had been festering in the hospital for years. Mr. Thompson entered the room, followed by several other members of the leadership team. He gave Claire a brief nod as he took his seat at the head of the table. "Claire," he began, his tone serious, "I've reviewed your report, and I have to say it's thorough. You've raised some important points, and I agree that we need to address the culture in this hospital. Claire felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had been worried that her concerns might be dismissed or minimized, but it seemed that Mr. Thompson was taking the issue seriously. We've been hearing more and more about the incident with Dr. Price, Mr. Thompson continued, and I think it's clear that we can't ignore this any longer. I'm in favor of implementing mandatory bias training for all staff, but I want to make sure we approach this carefully. We need to get buy-in from the medical staff, especially the senior doctors. Claire nodded in agreement. I understand. Change won't happen overnight, but we need to start somewhere. Mr. Thompson leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. I think it would be helpful if you took the lead on this, Claire. You have the respect of the staff, and I believe you're the right person to guide us through this process. Claire hesitated for a moment, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She knew that leading this effort would be challenging, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. I'd be honored to, she said, her voice steady. Meanwhile, Dr. Price's world was beginning to unravel. Word of the mandatory bias training had reached him, and it was clear that the leadership was taking the issue seriously. He hadn't realized how much damage his behavior had caused, not just with Claire, but with the entire nursing staff. His usual confidence was shaken, and for the first time, he found himself questioning the way he had treated his colleagues. As he sat in his office, staring blankly at his computer screen, the weight of his actions pressed down on him. He knew he couldn't continue as if nothing had happened, but he didn't know how to move forward. The following day, as Dr. Price walked through the halls of Oak Ridge, he noticed the way the staff looked at him. There was no longer the automatic deference he had grown accustomed to. Instead, there was a quiet sense of disappointment, even judgment. The nurses in particular seemed to avoid his gaze. Their respect for him diminished. Dr. Price felt a knot form in his stomach as he realized just how much he had lost. It wasn't just his reputation. It was the trust and respect of the people he worked with. And that, more than anything, was what stung the most. Later that evening, Dr. Price sat in his office, alone with his thoughts. He had always prided himself on being a top-tier surgeon, someone who could handle the pressures of the job without faltering. But now, for the first time, he feels vulnerable. The confrontation with Claire had shaken him in ways he hadn't anticipated, and he knew that if he didn't change, his career and his relationships with his colleagues would suffer. Dr. Price reached for his phone and sent a message to Claire. Dr. Price, can we talk? I think we need to clear the air. Claire received the message later that night, her initial reaction one of surprise. She hadn't expected Dr. Price to reach out to her directly, but she appreciated the gesture. After a moment of consideration, she replied, Claire, I think that would be a good idea. Let's meet tomorrow after rounds. As she set her phone down, Claire felt a sense of cautious optimism. Change wouldn't come easily, but this was a step in the right direction. The following morning, Claire Lawson and Dr. Samuel Price sat across from each other in one of the hospital's small conference rooms. The room was plain and unadorned, with a simple wooden table and chairs, but the tension between them made the air feel thick and heavy. Dr. Price looked visibly uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. Claire, on the other hand, maintained her calm demeanor, though her expression revealed the seriousness of the situation. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, as if both were gathering their thoughts. Claire broke the silence first, her voice soft but firm. Thank you for reaching out, Dr. Price, she began, looking him directly in the eyes. I think it's important we address what happened. Dr. Price shifted in his chair, the weight of his earlier actions pressing down on him. I realize I'm a mistake, he said slowly, his voice uncertain. I didn't know who you were, and I didn't mean to treat you with disrespect. Claire nodded but didn't let him off the hook so easily. It's not just about who I am, Dr. Price. It's about how you treat people, regardless of their title or position, whether I'm the medical director or a nurse. The way you spoke to me and to other staff members was unacceptable. Dr. Price's shoulders sagged slightly, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. I've been thinking about that, he admitted, his voice quieter now. And I realize that I've been acting like an jerk. Claire raised an eyebrow at his blunt admission, but remained silent, letting him continue. "I've always focused on being the best surgeon I can be," Dr. Price went on, "but I never thought about how my attitude affects the people around me. I guess I figured that as long as I was good at my job, that was enough. But I can see now that it's not." Claire leaned forward slightly, her tone softening. "Being good at your job is important, Dr. Price, but it's not the only thing that matters. How we treat each other in this hospital, whether we're doctors, nurses, or support staff, is just as important. This place can't run if we're all divided by ego and hierarchy." Dr. Price let out a sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've been in my own world for too long. I didn't even realize how bad things had gotten." Claire studied him for a moment, weighing her response. She could see that, Doctor. Price was genuinely grappling with his behavior, but she also knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. "You're not the only one, Doctor Price," Claire said gently. "There are systemic issues in this hospital that go beyond just one person. But you have the power to be part of the solution if you're willing to change." Dr. Price nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I am willing," he said quietly, "but I don't know where to start." Claire offered him a small, encouraging smile. "The first step is acknowledging the problem. The second is working with the rest of us to fix it." As the days passed, the atmosphere in Oak Ridge Medical Center became increasingly tense. Word had spread that hospital leadership was taking the issue of staff treatment seriously, and mandatory diversity and bias training had been announced for all employees. While many staff members welcomed the change, there were others, particularly some of the senior doctors, who were less enthusiastic. Dr. Price, once a symbol of untouchable authority in the hospital, now found himself under scrutiny from both his peers and the junior staff. The confrontation with Claire had shaken his confidence, but it had also opened his eyes to the flaws in his behavior. He attended the diversity training sessions without complaint, determined to understand the perspectives of those he had dismissed for so long. Meanwhile, Claire continued to lead the charge for change. Her report had been well received by the hospital's leadership, and she had been asked to take a more active role in shaping the reforms. She worked closely with Mr. David Thompson and other administrators to ensure that the training sessions went beyond surface-level conversations and addressed the deeper issues of bias and power dynamics that plagued the hospital. The nurses and junior doctors, many of whom had long felt powerless in the face of the hospital's hierarchy, began to feel a sense of hope. Claire's leadership was making a difference, and the culture of the hospital was slowly starting to shift. But change was never easy, and there were still pockets of resistance. Some of the senior doctors, particularly those who had been in the hospital for years, were resistant to the idea of mandatory training. They saw it as an unnecessary distraction from their work, and they resented the implication that they were part of the problem. Dr. Price, once one of the most vocal critics of such initiatives, now found himself in a strange position. He understood why the training was necessary, but he also knew that many of his colleagues wouldn't see it that way. He was no longer the untouchable figure he had once been to, and for the first time, he felt what it was like to be on the outside looking in. One day, as Dr. Price walked through the hospital halls, he overheard a conversation between two nurses at the nurses' station. "I never thought I'd see the day when Dr. Price actually attended one of these trainings," one of the nurses said, her voice filled with disbelief. "Yeah, it's like the whole hospital's changing," the other nurse replied. "Claire's really shaking things up." Dr. Price paused, listening to their conversation with a mixture of guilt and curiosity. He knew that his reputation had taken a hit, and he wasn't sure how to rebuild it. But the more he listened to the staff, the more he realized how deeply his behavior had affected them. As he continued down the hall, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer the man he had once been, or at least not the man he had thought he was. Later that day, as he prepared for surgery, Dr. Price found himself working alongside Claire once again. This time, however, there was no tension between them, only a quiet understanding that things were changing. "Dr. Lawson," Dr. Price said as they scrubbed in for surgery, his voice more respectful than it had been in the past. "I just wanted to thank you." Claire looked at him, slightly surprised. "For what?" "For helping me see things differently," Dr. Price replied. "I've been attending the trainings and, well, it's opened my eyes." Claire smiled softly. "I'm glad to hear that, Dr. Price. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary." Dr. Price nodded, his expression thoughtful. I know, and I'm trying. Claire's smile widened slightly. That's all I can ask. The surgery went smoothly with Dr. Price and Claire working together as a team. For the first time in years, Dr. Price didn't feel the need to assert his dominance or belittle the staff. Instead, he listened to their input, respected their expertise, and recognized the value of their contributions. It was a small but significant shift in his behavior, and it didn't go unnoticed by the staff. After the surgery, Dr. Price found himself reflecting on the changes he had seen in himself and in the hospital as a whole. He knew that he had a long way to go, but he also knew that he was on the right path. For the first time, he felt a sense of humility, a recognition that he wasn't infallible and that he could learn from those around him. As the days passed, Dr. Price continued to attend the diversity and bias training sessions, engaging in the discussions with an open mind. He listened to the experiences of nurses and junior doctors, many of whom had felt overlooked and dismissed for years. Their stories resonated with him in ways he hadn't anticipated, and he found himself reevaluating his behavior and the culture he had been complicit in maintaining. Meanwhile, Claire remained steadfast in her mission to create lasting change at Oak Ridge Medical Center. She knew that the reforms she had helped implement were only the beginning, and that it would take time to dismantle the deeply ingrained biases that had shaped the hospital's culture for so long. But she also knew that progress was being made, and that gave her hope. Several weeks after their initial confrontation, Dr. Price requested another meeting with Claire. This time, it wasn't out of guilt or obligation, but out of a genuine desire to make amends. As they sat across from each other in the conference room once again, Dr. Price looked Claire in the eye, his expression sincere. "I wanted to thank you again, Doctor. Lawson," he said, his voice steady, "you've helped me see things that I was blind to for far too long. I know I have a lot to make up for, but I'm committed to changing." Claire smiled warmly, appreciating the vulnerability in his words. "It's never too late to start, Doctor." "Price," she replied, "we all have things to learn, and I'm glad you're willing to take that step." Dr. Price let out a small sigh of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I've been working with the other doctors, trying to get them on board with the changes we're making. Some of them are resistant, but I'm doing my best to show them why it's important." Claire nodded, her smile widening. "That's all I can ask for, Doctor." "Price, change isn't easy, but it's worth it." As they shook hands, a sense of mutual respect passed between them. Dr. Price had come a long way since their first confrontation, and while there was still work to be done, Claire knew that he was on the path to redemption. In the weeks that followed, the culture at Oak Ridge Medical Center began to shift in meaningful ways. The mandatory diversity and bias training sessions continued, and staff members reported feeling more respected and valued in their roles. Nurses and junior doctors, who had once felt powerless in the face of the hospital's hierarchy, now felt empowered to speak up and share their ideas. Dr. Price, once known for his arrogance and dismissiveness, became a surprising advocate for change. He worked closely with Claire and the hospital leadership to ensure that the reforms were implemented effectively, and he made a concerted effort to rebuild the trust he had lost with the staff. For Claire, the changes represented a victory, not for herself, but for the hospital as a whole. She had always believed that leadership was about lifting others up, and now she was seeing the fruits of her labor. The hospital was becoming a more inclusive and respectful place, and the staff were beginning to work together as a true team. As she walked through the halls of Oak Ridge, Claire couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but she knew that the hospital was on the right path, and in the end, that was all that mattered. As Oak Ridge Medical Center adjusted to its new cultural environment, Claire Lawson could sense the subtle but significant changes rippling through the institution. The mandatory diversity and bias training sessions had begun to break down the barriers that had once divided doctors, nurses, and support staff. Conversations that once seemed impossible were now happening openly, and for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of camaraderie emerging among the hospital staff. Claire, now a central figure in guiding the hospital's transformation, found herself busier than ever. She continued to work closely with Mr. David Thompson, ensuring that the reforms went beyond surface-level policies and reached deep into the hospital's ethos. Every day she was reminded of how far they had come, but also of how much further they had to go. One afternoon, Claire sat in her office, reviewing the progress reports from the various departments. While most staff members had adapted to the changes, there were still some who resisted. A few senior doctors had complained about the mandatory training, viewing it as an unnecessary distraction from patient care. Claire understood their frustrations, but she also knew that these changes were essential for the hospital's long-term success. She leaned back in her chair, glancing at her phone, which buzzed with a message from Janelle Hayes. "Janelle, how are things going over there?" Claire smiled, appreciating Janelle's constant support. "Claire, making progress, but still a lot of resistance from some of the old guards. How about you?" A moment later, Janelle replied, "Janelle, same, these changes are overdue, but people don't like being told they need to change, especially when they've been doing things the same way for years." Claire sighed as she set her phone down. She knew Janelle was right. Resistance to change was natural, but that didn't make it any easier to handle. Still, Claire was determined to push forward. Oak Ridge had come too far to turn back now. Later that week, Claire met with Mr. David Thompson in his office to discuss the hospital's progress. Mr. Thompson had been a strong advocate for the reforms from the beginning, but he even knew that they were navigating uncharted territory. "Claire," he began, glancing over the latest report, "I have to say I'm impressed with how smoothly things have gone so far. The training sessions are being well received by most of the staff, and I've heard some positive feedback from the nurses and junior doctors." Claire nodded, though her expression remained serious. "I'm glad to hear that, David, but there are still pockets of resistance, especially among some of the senior doctors. They see this as a challenge to their authority." Mr. Thompson sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I figured as much. It's hard to convince people to change when they think they've already mastered their craft. But we both know that this isn't about their skills. It's about how they treat people." "Exactly," Claire agreed. "The bias training isn't about undermining their medical expertise. It's about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their role, is treated with the respect they deserve. If we don't address these issues now, they'll only fester and get worse." Mr. Thompson rubbed his temples, clearly feeling the weight of the task at hand. "I know you're right, Claire. We just have to keep pushing forward. The board is fully behind these changes, and as long as we have their support, we can weather the resistance." Claire smiled softly. "Thank you, David. Your support means a lot, especially when there's pushback." Mr. Thompson nodded. "We'll get through this, Claire. Just keep doing what you're doing. The staff respects you, and that makes all the difference." Meanwhile, Dr. Samuel Price had continued his own journey of self-reflection and change. The once arrogant surgeon, who had ruled his department with an iron fist, was slowly becoming a different man. The diversity and bias training sessions had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, truths he had long ignored. One day, as Dr. Price sat in on a particularly emotional training session, he listened as one of the nurses, Emily Clark, shared her experiences working in the hospital. Emily had been at Oak Ridge for nearly a decade, and she had witnessed firsthand the dismissive attitudes that many doctors had toward the nursing staff. "I've worked here for years," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And in all that time, I've seen nurses treated as if we're just here to take orders, as if our contributions don't matter. But we're the ones at the patients' bedsides, day in and day out. We see things the doctors don't, and yet we're often ignored or dismissed." Dr. Price shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Emily's words sank in. He had been guilty of exactly what she was describing, and for the first time, he realized just how much damage his behavior had caused. "After the session ended, Doctor," Price approached Emily, his earnest expression. "Emily," he began, his voice soft, "I just wanted to say thank you for sharing what you did in there. I know I've been part of the problem, and I want to apologize for the way I've treated you and the other nurses." Emily looked at him, surprised by his words. "Doctor Price, thank you. I appreciate you saying that." Dr. Price nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "I'm trying to do better. I hope you'll give me a chance to prove that." Emily smiled warmly. "We all make mistakes, Doctor Price. What matters is that you're trying to change. That's all we can ask for." As Dr. Price walked away, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't easy to admit his faults, but he knew it was the first step toward healing the rift between him and the staff. As more staff members embraced the changes at Oak Ridge, the hospital's power dynamics began to shift. Where once the senior doctors had ruled with unquestioned authority, now the nurses and support staff felt empowered to speak up and share their perspectives. The hospital's hierarchy was still in place, but it was no longer as rigid as it had been before. One day during a staff meeting, Claire noticed something remarkable. Dr. Price, who had once dominated every conversation, now sat quietly, listening to the input of the nurses and junior doctors. He no longer felt the need to assert his superiority. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in hearing what others had to say. At one point, Dr. Michael Cooper, the young doctor who had once felt intimidated by Dr. Price's arrogance, spoke up. "I think we need to rethink how we approach post-op care for our surgical patients," Dr. Cooper suggested. "The nurses have been suggesting some changes that could make a big difference in patient recovery times, and I think we should seriously consider them." Claire watched as Dr. Price nodded in agreement, his expression thoughtful. "I agree," Dr. Price said. "The nurses are with the patients more than we are. Their insights are valuable, and we should listen to them." The room fell silent for a moment, as if everyone was processing the significance of what had just happened. Dr. Price, the man who had once dismissed the nurses without a second thought, was now advocating for their input. Claire felt a swell of pride as she watched the hospital's transformation unfold before her eyes. It hadn't been easy, but the changes were taking root. The hospital was becoming a place where everyone's voice mattered, and where respect flowed in all directions. Several months after the reforms had been implemented, the hospital felt like a different place. The power dynamics had shifted, and the staff worked together with a sense of mutual respect and understanding. Nurses, doctors, and support staff collaborated more openly, sharing ideas and listening to one another. Claire, who had been at the center of this transformation, could see the results of her efforts in the way the hospital now operates. There were still challenges. Of course, old habits were hard to break, and some staff members still resisted change. But overall, the culture at Oak Ridge had shifted for the better. One afternoon, as Claire walked through the hospital, she was stopped by Aiden Brooks, a junior doctor who had been working under Dr. Price. "Dr. Lawson," Aiden said, his voice filled with admiration, "I just wanted to thank you. I've seen how much things have changed around here, and I know it's because of you." Claire smiled, humbled by his words. "It wasn't just me, Aiden. It was all of us. Change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens when we all work together." Aiden nodded, his respect for Claire evident in his expression. "Still, you showed us that change was possible, and for that, I'm grateful." As Claire continued her walk through the hospital, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. Oak Ridge was on a new path, one that valued every member of its staff and created an environment where everyone could thrive. Several months into the hospital's transformation, Oak Ridge Medical Center faced one of its most challenging days yet. A massive car accident on the highway had sent dozens of patients to the hospital's emergency department, overwhelming the staff and pushing the entire facility to its limits. Nurses, doctors, and support staff scrambled to care for the influx of critical patients, and the entire hospital was thrown into chaos. Claire Lawson was immediately called to the emergency department to oversee the response. As the medical director, she had to ensure that every available resource was mobilized and that the staff worked efficiently to handle the crisis. It was a moment where leadership and teamwork would be tested in ways they hadn't been before. As she entered the emergency room, Claire's calm demeanor belied the intensity of the situation. The sounds of monitors beeping, doctors giving rapid instructions, and the urgent rush of gurneys filled the space. Claire moved swiftly, coordinating with nurses and physicians, ensuring that no patient was left unattended. In the middle of the chaos, Claire caught sight of Dr. Samuel Price. He was in the operating room, preparing for emergency surgery on one of the accident victims. This would be the ultimate test for Dr. Price. Could he maintain the newfound respect and humility he had been working on, or would the pressure push him back to his old ways? Claire made her way to the operating room to observe. Dr. Price had a team of nurses and junior doctors assisting him, including Emily Clark, the nurse he had once belittled. As the surgery began, Claire watched closely, noting how Dr. Price interacted with his team. In the operating room, the tension was palpable. The patient on the table was in critical condition, with multiple internal injuries that required immediate intervention. Dr. Price's hands were steady as he worked, but the pressure of the situation was immense. At one point during the surgery, Emily noticed something on the patient's monitor that indicated a potential complication. Without hesitation, she spoke up. "Dr. Price, I'm seeing irregularities in the patient's heart rate. We may need to adjust our approach," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. In the past, Dr. Price might have dismissed her input, focusing solely on his own judgment. But today, things were different. He paused for a moment, considering Emily's observation, and then nodded. "You're right," Dr. Price replied, his tone respectful. "Let's make the adjustment." It was a small moment, but one that signaled a monumental shift in Dr. Price's behavior. He was no longer the arrogant surgeon who dismissed the input of his colleagues. Instead, he had become a true leader, one who valued the expertise of everyone in his team. As the surgery continued, Dr. Price worked seamlessly with the nurses and junior doctors, listening to their suggestions and adjusting his approach when necessary. By the time the surgery was complete, the patient's condition had stabilized, and the entire team let out a collective sigh of relief. In the observation room, Claire watched the scene unfold with a sense of pride. Dr. Price had come a long way, and this moment proved that he was truly committed to change. Once the emergency situation had calmed down and the influx of patients had been managed, the hospital staff gathered for a debriefing. It was customary to review the response to major incidents, ensuring that any lessons learned could be applied in the future. As the meeting began, Mr. David Thompson stood at the front of the room, addressing the group. "I want to start by thanking each and every one of you for your hard work today," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "We were tested in ways we haven't been before, and I'm proud of how we came together to care for our patients." Claire sat among the staff, feeling a sense of unity that hadn't existed in the hospital before. The teamwork that had emerged during the crisis was a testament to the changes they had worked so hard to implement. Everyone, from the senior doctors to the nurses and support staff, had played a vital role in the hospital's success that day. As the meeting continued, Mr. Thompson singled out Dr. Price for his leadership in the operating room. "Dr. Price, I've heard nothing but praise for the way you handled the surgery today," Mr. Thompson said. "Your collaboration with the team was exemplary." Dr. Price, who had once basked in the glow of praise for his individual achievements, now looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention. He glanced at his team, a small smile on his face. "I can't take all the credit," Dr. Price said, his voice humble. "It was a team effort, and I couldn't have done it without the input of the nurses and doctors who worked alongside me." The room was silent for a moment as everyone processed Dr. Price's words. It was a stark contrast to the man he had been to just months earlier, a man who had once dismissed the contributions of those around him. Now he was acknowledging the value of teamwork and giving credit where it was due. Claire felt a surge of pride as she listened to Dr. Price. His transformation was complete, and the hospital was better for it. A few days after the crisis, Claire found herself sitting in her office, reflecting on the journey they had all been on. The changes at Oak Ridge Medical Center had not come easily, and there had been moments when Claire had doubted whether they would succeed. But now, as she looked back, she realized just how far they had come. The hospital had become a place where respect flowed in all directions, where every staff member's voice mattered, and where collaboration was valued over hierarchy. Claire knew there was still work to be done, but she also knew that they were on the right path. As she sat at her desk, her phone buzzed with a message from Janelle. "Janelle, I heard about how well everything went during the crisis. Congratulations." Claire smiled as she typed her response. "Claire, thank you. It wasn't easy, but we made it through. Everyone really came together." A moment later, Janelle replied, "Janelle, you've done amazing work, Claire. Oak Ridge is lucky to have you." Claire set her phone down, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about personal recognition or accolades. It was about the difference she had made in the lives of the people who worked at Oak Ridge and the patients they cared for. As the weeks passed, the changes at the hospital continued to take root. The training sessions became a regular part of the staff's development, and the hospital leadership made a point of promoting more diverse and inclusive practices. Nurses, junior doctors, and even custodial staff reported feeling more respected and valued in their roles. The incident with Dr. Price, once a source of tension and conflict, had become a symbol of the hospital's transformation. It served as a reminder of how far they had come and how much work there was still to do. In the months that followed, Oak Ridge Medical Center continued to thrive. The culture of respect and collaboration that Claire had fought so hard to implement had become ingrained in the hospital's daily operations. Staff members felt empowered to speak up, share their ideas, and contribute to the hospital's success. Claire remained at the heart of this transformation, though she never sought the spotlight. She continued to lead with humility and grace, always focused on the mission at hand, creating a workplace where everyone, regardless of their position, background, or race, was treated with dignity and respect. One evening, as Claire left the hospital after a long day, she paused to look back at the building. The lights of Oak Ridge Medical Center shone brightly against the night sky, a symbol of the work they had done and the progress they had made. Claire smiled, knowing that the future of Oak Ridge was bright. There would always be challenges, but as long as they continued to work together, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. With that thought in mind, Claire turned and walked into the night, ready for whatever came next. Months after the crisis that had tested Oak Ridge Medical Center, the hospital had settled into its new rhythm. The changes that Claire Lawson had spearheaded were no longer seen as temporary reforms, but as the foundation of a new culture. Respect, collaboration, and accountability became the cornerstones of the hospital's operations. Claire often found herself reflecting on how far they had come. What had started as a confrontation between her and Dr. Price had grown into something much larger, a systemic shift that had touched every corner of the hospital. Nurses felt empowered to speak up, junior doctors were being mentored in ways that fostered mutual respect, and even senior physicians were embracing a more collaborative approach to patient care. The impact of the changes at Oak Ridge had not gone unnoticed by the broader medical community. Other hospitals had begun to take note of Oak Ridge's success, reaching out to Claire for advice on implementing similar reforms. Claire had been invited to speak at several medical conferences, sharing her experience of transforming a deeply entrenched culture. One afternoon, as she prepared for a speaking engagement at a local conference, Claire received an unexpected call from Mr. David Thompson, the chief administrator at Oak Ridge. "Claire," Mr. Thompson said, his voice filled with pride, "I wanted to let you know that we've been receiving inquiries from hospitals all over the country. They've heard about what you've done here, and they want to learn from our success." Claire smiled as she listened, feeling a sense of fulfillment. "That's wonderful, David. I'm glad the work we've done is resonating with others." Mr. Thompson chuckled. "It's more than just resonating. You've started a movement, Claire. Hospitals everywhere are looking to follow in our footsteps, and it's all because of your leadership." Claire felt warmth spread through her chest. She had never sought recognition or personal glory, but knowing that her efforts were making a difference beyond Oak Ridge was deeply gratifying. "Thank you, David," she said softly, "but it wasn't just me. It was all of us." Dr. Samuel Price had undergone a profound transformation since the day he had confronted Claire in the hospital hallways. His once arrogant demeanor had given way to humility, and he had become a staunch advocate for the hospital's new culture. He worked closely with Claire and the other hospital leaders to ensure that the changes continued to take root. Dr. Price had even taken on a new role as a mentor to the junior doctors and surgical residents at Oak Ridge. His newfound respect for teamwork and collaboration had made him an invaluable teacher, and the younger doctors looked up to him in ways they hadn't before. One afternoon, Dr. Price found himself in the operating room once again, this time supervising a young surgeon performing her first solo surgery. As he watched her work, he couldn't help but reflect on his own journey. The mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned, and the person he had become. The surgery went smoothly, and as the young surgeon finished, Dr. Price offered her a warm smile. "You did a great job," he said, his tone encouraging. "You've got a bright future ahead of you." The young surgeon beamed with pride. "Thank you, Dr. Price. Your guidance has meant a lot to me." As Dr. Price left the operating room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of redemption. He had come a long way from the man who had once dismissed the people around him. Now he was committed to lifting others up, just as Claire had lifted him. One evening, as Claire sat at home with a cup of tea, her phone buzzed with a call from Janelle Hayes. Claire answered with a smile, always happy to hear from her close friend. "Hey, Janelle," Claire said warmly. "How are things going?" "Things are good," Janelle replied. "But I heard you've been busy. Mr. Thompson told me you're becoming quite the celebrity in the medical world." Claire chuckled softly. "I wouldn't go that far. But yes, I've been speaking at a few conferences. It's nice to see that people are interested in what we've done at Oak Ridge." Janelle's voice was filled with admiration. "You've done something amazing, Claire. You've changed an entire institution, and now other hospitals are following your lead." "That's no small feat," Claire's smile softened. "It's been a long road, but I'm proud of what we've accomplished, and I'm grateful for the support I've had along the way." "Well, you deserve every bit of praise you're getting," Janelle said firmly, "and I have no doubt that Oak Ridge will continue to thrive under your leadership." As the conversation continued, Claire couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had stood by her throughout the journey. Janelle, Mr. Thompson, the nurses, and even Dr. Price. They had all played a role in making Oak Ridge the place it was today. As Oak Ridge Medical Center continued to evolve, Claire remained focused on the future. She knew that the work of creating an inclusive, respectful, and collaborative environment was never truly finished. There would always be new challenges, new obstacles to overcome, but she was ready for whatever came next. One afternoon, as she walked through the hospital, Claire stopped to speak with Emily Clark, the nurse who had once been on the receiving end of Dr. Price's arrogance. Emily had become one of the hospital's most vocal advocates for change, and her leadership among the nursing staff was making a significant impact. "Emily," Claire said, smiling warmly, "I just wanted to tell you how proud I am of the work you've been doing. The nursing staff really looks up to you." Emily blushed slightly, clearly touched by the compliment. "Thank you, Dr. Lawson. I've learned a lot from you. You've shown all of us what true leadership looks like." Claire's smile widened. "You're a leader in your own right, Emily. Keep doing what you're doing." As they parted ways, Claire couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The changes they had made at Oak Ridge were in good hands, and she knew that the hospital would continue to thrive long after she was gone. As the years passed, Oak Ridge Medical Center became a model of excellence in patient care, collaboration, and respect. The changes that Claire and her team had implemented had become ingrained in the hospital's culture, and other institutions looked to Oak Ridge as an example of what could be achieved when people work together toward a common goal. Claire's leadership had left an indelible mark on the hospital, and her legacy was felt in every corner of the institution. She had shown the staff that true leadership wasn't about titles or authority. It was about lifting others up, listening to their voices, and creating an environment where everyone felt valued. Dr. Price, once known for his arrogance, had become one of the hospital's most respected figures. His transformation inspired others to reflect on their own behavior and strive for personal growth, and the nurses who had once felt overlooked and dismissed were now integral members of the hospital's decision-making process. As Claire sat in her office one evening, reflecting on all that had been accomplished, she felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. Oak Ridge Medical Center was thriving, and the future was bright. Claire's phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Thompson. "Mr. Thompson, I just wanted to say thank you, Claire. You've changed this hospital in ways we never could have imagined. We're all better for it." Claire smiled as she read the message, her heart full. "Claire, thank you, David. But this was a team effort. We did this together." As she put her phone down, Claire knew that her work at Oak Ridge was far from over. There were always new challenges to face, new ways to grow. But she was ready for whatever came next. With a contented sigh, Claire gathered her things and headed out of her office, knowing that the legacy of Oak Ridge would continue to thrive for years to come. As Claire walked out of Oak Ridge Medical Center that evening, she took one last look at the building that had been her second home for so many years. The lights shone brightly against the night sky, a beacon of hope and progress. Claire smiled to herself, knowing that she had helped create something truly special. Oak Ridge was more than just a hospital. It was a community, a place where people worked together, respected each other, and strived for excellence. And that, Claire knew, was the greatest legacy she could leave behind. With that thought in mind, Claire turned and walked into the night, ready for the next chapter of her journey, whatever it might be. Don't miss out on more inspiring stories like this one. Click subscribe to stay updated with our latest content on leadership, teamwork, and personal growth.